Hey guys, what's going on? Blaine back for another Netflix review, and today I'm going to be talking about Layla Majnun. To begin with, I was very interested going into this review because it's actually the first ever Indonesian film that I've ever watched. It tells the story of a girl named Layla, and right at the beginning of the movie we see that she has a tragic backstory as we see her and her mother cradling her dead father in their arms. He passed away from some sort of sailboat accident, I think it was, and he ended up drowning, and then the rest of his family, the male members in her family specifically, start selling off family possessions in order to make some money off of his passing. Among these possessions include a collection of shadow puppets that Layla holds dear to her heart, but her uncle decides to take matters into his own hands and starts selling them off just to get that extra money back. So right from the get-go, we see an obvious patriarchal element going on in that family, and how the male family members seem to be the one that call the shots, whereas the women in the family don't really get as much say, if any at all. After this, it flash forwards into the future, and we see Layla working as a school teacher, teaching an Indonesian language class to her students. Despite the tragic events that we see happen to her at the beginning, it's evident that she was able to move past that trauma, and she was able to become a successful woman in her own right. However, it's not long until Layla comes home from school one day that she finds out that a marriage has actually been arranged for her. This completely goes against her wishes, as she wants to marry someone without having to be forced to or having someone else being sought out for her, so to say. And she wants to be able to pursue her dreams as an educator in other parts of the world as well. So there's all sorts of power struggles and dynamics that are playing in the background, and we see this all happen right at the beginning. We see how independent and headstrong of a personality that Layla really is, as well as how controlling some of the figures are around her in her life. There are positive role models in her life, of course. There's her mother, who's kind of stuck in the middle as she has to try and balance the power struggle between Layla and her uncle, as well as her brother, who's currently in Azerbaijan. Anyway, she's arranged to marry this guy named Ibnu, and at first he seems like a decent enough guy. Layla agrees to marry Ibnu on two conditions. One, that he supports her going to whatever teaching job that she wants, and two, that she's able to pursue her dreams of going to teach in Azerbaijan. Ibnu is kind of weirded out by this at first, but he is desperate to have a wife, so he says, yeah, go ahead, whatever you want. As long as we end up being married, as long as you're happy, I'm happy. And as events develop later on in the story, that's definitely not going to be the case. I'll admit that I was kind of weirded out by the whole arranged marriage thing at first, and how the woman doesn't really get a choice in the matter, but I had to remember that this movie was filmed in a completely different part of the world where many of these kinds of things are, simply put, they're the norm. Not necessarily that people want those particular things, but there are some women in that particular culture who don't necessarily mind having a marriage arranged for them. So it took a little while for my Western sensibilities to kind of get used to another part of the world and how things operate as such. Once I got past this, however, I was not only able to appreciate the setting of where the film takes place in, but I was also able to sympathize with Layla that much more as a character. Being a teacher myself, I completely empathize with Layla's want to go to another part of the world and try things out and see how it was. I've taught in countries like Japan and UK myself, and I love just being able having the freedom to do that and being able to explore my own personal interests. But being born in a country like Canada, I have the ability to pursue those passions whenever I want with little to no restriction, as long as there's visas and things like that that are covered and I'm following the law as best as possible. So it made me feel that much more sorry for Layla. The fact that she has to fight for her ability to educate. The fact that she doesn't have this level of autonomy compared to all the male figures around her life. She does end up meeting another male figure, which sets up the romance between the two characters and is the whole reason why the movie is around to begin with. This is very much a romantic drama. Layla ends up going to Azerbaijan to teach her class, and right in the first class she meets a guy named Samir. Samir is a local Azerbaijani citizen who is obsessed with studying Indonesian culture and actually learns the language prior to Layla going over there to teach. And I have to say, Samir was super bold in the way that he introduced himself to Layla. Samir just straight up chirps out another student who's like, oh, this subject matter's dumb and stupid, or something like that. And anyway, Layla asks a question to Samir, and then he responds in the most confident manner, and then after that, he just straight up invites her on a date, and then everyone else in the room's like, what? And then he kind of saves the situation by inviting everyone else in the classroom, saying that he'll buy lunch, and everyone else raises their hands like, oh yeah, I'm totally in, man. I just loved how bold of a character he was in the beginning, and you see how studious of a person he is too. He's not just some random guy that falls in love with a random girl. He's actually deeply invested in the culture of Indonesia, and we see that right from the very first scene that we see him in. From there, the movie plays out more or less as it should. It follows Layla and Samir developing a friendly relationship with each other, at least at first anyway. And then over the course of the story, they start to get to know each other more, they start to learn about each other's personalities, their desires, their interests, and then of course, who they are as people. Despite her interest in Samir, however, she can't agree to break her promise that she made to Ibnu, the guy that she agreed to get married to early on in the movie. And so the main dramatic conflict in this movie is Layla trying to compromise her affection that she has for Samir and the marriage that she's obligated to fulfill with Ibnu. And this whole time I was just begging Layla, like, please, come on, just do it. You know you love Samir, just go for it. But I realized that my Western sensibilities were getting in the way of the actual story and how it was meant to be interpreted, and so I had to think more from the perspective of the Indonesian filmmakers behind this movie. And there are other characters in this movie that try to reinforce to Layla that, listen, you need to do what you want to do in your life. You can't let anyone push you around. If there's someone that you're genuinely in love with, that's the person that you're meant to be with, not this random guy that your uncle's trying to set you up with. I just loved all the power struggles that were happening in this movie. There was always some sort of conflict happening between Layla and Samir, or Layla and her uncle. There was just all sorts of drama happening going on all the time. That said, I felt while watching this movie that some of the sad scenes in this movie were a little bit too sad in my opinion. At times it felt like Samir and Layla were being hot and cold with each other. Just when things start to get interesting between these two, there's always something tragic or horrible that ends up separating the two, and it makes one of them more ambivalent toward the other, and then there's some sort of conflict that happens between them, and then we end up going back to square one. I understand that whenever there's drama, there has to be conflict, because otherwise there is no drama. However, it just felt so frustrating to see the two get so close to being together only to have something else separate them. And it just kept pulling and pushing back and forth constantly throughout the story. And I was just like, oh, come on, just be together already. I have watched K-dramas and other Asian films in the past, so I am kind of sort of aware of what audiences' tastes are in Asia as far as romance is concerned. So for all I know, maybe this is the kind of stuff that Asian audiences want in their movies, and maybe this movie just wasn't necessarily made for me, at least fully made for me anyway. I also really hate what they did with the Ibnu character at the end, in a good way, that is. Right from the beginning when we see him in the movie, we know deep down that he is not the person that he says he is, and we see that play out as the story goes on. I'm not going to spoil the story right now in this review, but just so you know, if you do watch this movie, you will hate Ibnu by the end. Other things I thought in this movie that did work, the location shots in Azerbaijan, specifically in the capital city of Baku, were absolutely amazing. I loved seeing all the European architecture, all the statues and parks that the characters go to. It's a really unique setting for a romantic drama. I honestly don't think I've seen a movie filmed in Azerbaijan up to this point. I would love to see more movies like this show off all the architecture that places like Azerbaijan have to show to audiences. There's just a really cool vibe throughout the movie that plays out as the story goes along. We see people that we're not used to seeing, we see settings we're not used to seeing. There's just a real sense of uniqueness in this film that I have a hard time comparing to other romantic movies. This is especially evident whenever there's some sort of party or festival or some sort of gathering happening between the characters. Usually this concerns Layla and Samir when they're going to have a dinner together, or they're going to attend a dance party, something like that. And throughout the story we see all these flashbacks whenever Samir and Layla are wearing these really flamboyant costumes. I'm assuming they're wedding clothes in Indonesia, and we see them dancing around, they're being happy with each other, and I just loved how much culture there was in this movie. There's simply nothing else that I've seen that compares to Layla Majnun. I found out before making this review that the story of this movie is actually based on the story of Layla and Majnun, which is of Arabic origin. In the story, Layla and Majnun, or Kays I think his name is, and I apologize if I'm saying that name wrong. Layla and Kays fall in love, but I think it's Layla's father who disapproves of the relationship, and he does his best to try and prevent it from happening between the two. I think the difference between that story and this movie story is that I'm pretty sure Layla's father would have been nothing but supportive of the relationship between her and Samir. But it is a movie, so you gotta take some artistic liberties where you can. As long as your story makes sense by the time it ends, and your audience enjoys it, that's all that really matters. And speaking of the ending, I really wasn't quite a fan of it. And I understand the direction that they took with it, similar to how another movie I saw recently, Red Dot, did with their ending, but I thought it went way over the top in terms of drama and all the things that were leading to the buildup of that particular scene at the end. Again, I won't spoil it, but I thought it was a little bit much. And there isn't really any sort of falling action. The story just kind of ends, and then there's like a little credit sequence, and then there's a little scene, and then that's it. I'm trying to be as ambiguous with my wording as possible without spoiling the movie for those of you who are interested in seeing it, but I wasn't really the biggest fan of how it ended. I would have liked to see just a little bit more information, a little bit more background info as to what happened after that particular scene. Overall, Layla Majnun was a very fun movie for me to watch. I really enjoyed what I saw, and I love the cultural enrichment that it gave me as far as seeing what Azerbaijan and Indonesia looked like from a filmmaker's perspective. I love that movies like these are being made in parts of the world that are considered not as developed as, say, Canada or United States. And this movie gave me a newfound appreciation for filmmakers that live in those parts of the world that are still able to come up with an artistic vision, and they're able to see it through to the end. In that regard, I really love what Layla Majnun accomplished. It tells a familiar story while modernizing it for today's audiences. If you're really into tearjerker movies, specifically those that come from an Asian demographic, this movie would be right up your alley. There are plenty of dramatic moments to go around for everyone who sees it. I personally didn't like all the overdramatic stuff that happened into it, but I do understand why it's there, and the character development and interactions that Layla and Samir had between each other was more than enough to make it up for me. Overall, I do recommend this movie for anyone who wants to watch a movie that's completely different from what they're used to. You will not be disappointed. Anyways, guys, that's going to wrap up my review of Layla Majnun. Thanks for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and as always, stay tuned for the next part, where next time I review the British miniseries Behind Her Eyes. Bye-bye.